There's a moment that changes everything. Sometimes it slips by quietly, with nobody noticing until it's too late. Other times, it cracks through the day like thunder, so loud and public that the whole world turns to watch. That's exactly what happened inside River Point National Bank at 2:43 p.m. on a Friday that started out like any other. Nobody knew the routine day was about to become the center of a national conversation. A conversation that would leave everyone asking themselves what justice really means. Natalie Brooks stood near the glass entrance, shoulders back, chin raised, breathing slow and steady. She looked like someone used to walking into important rooms. But today, she wore only a soft gray hoodie, faded jeans, and simple sneakers. No jewelry, no fancy bag, not even a hint of makeup. Most people would have walked past her without a second glance. But Natalie wasn't most people, and she hadn't come here for small talk. She was here for business. Across the lobby, seated at a heavy wooden desk polished until it gleamed, was the bank manager, Richard Hale. Richard had worked at River Point National for over 20 years and prided himself on knowing every regular by sight. He watched people for a living, who was nervous, who carried cash, who belonged. That Friday, he was already thinking about the weekend ahead when a security guard, Paul DeLuca, leaned in to whisper, "Sir, someone's here to see you. She says it's about a loan." Richard barely glanced up. "Send her over," he replied, already expecting the usual. Small talk, maybe a car loan, something simple. But as Natalie crossed the floor, he noticed her steady pace, the manila folder tucked beneath her arm and the calm, determined look in her eyes. "Good afternoon," Natalie said, voice clear but gentle, offering a small smile. "I'm here to discuss my business loan application. My name's Natalie Brooks." Richard's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. He forced a polite smile and motioned for her to sit. "Ms. Brooks, is it? What sort of business are we talking about?" He scanned her quickly. Clothes, shoes, posture, even the way she held her folder. Years of habit made his judgment quick and sometimes unfair. Natalie noticed, but she kept her expression neutral. "It's a community outreach center," she replied. "A place to support local youth, small businesses, and provide job training programs. I've submitted all the paperwork online, but I wanted to follow up in person." Richard nodded slowly, pulling up her application on his computer. He barely looked at the details before closing the window. Instead, he picked up a bottle of hand sanitizer and began cleaning his hands, eyes never leaving her face. "We get a lot of these applications," he said, voice growing sharper. "A lot of big ideas, not much real backing. You know what I mean?" Natalie said nothing, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make Richard uncomfortable. "If you have questions about my application, I'm happy to answer them," she offered, her tone even. The room felt colder suddenly, tension growing as a few customers nearby glanced over curiously. Richard's hand hovered over the mouse, but he didn't open her file again. Instead, he asked, "Loans of this size, $2 million, are very rare for people just walking off the street. Do you have any collateral?" Natalie reached into her folder, her movements calm and precise. "All the details are in here, sir. My financial records, business plan, letters of recommendation. I can explain anything you need." Richard didn't take the folder. Instead, he pushed his chair back, voice carrying across the room. "Ma'am, would you mind emptying your pockets and stepping away from my desk?" The security guard straightened, and a hush fell over the lobby. For a moment, it felt like everyone had stopped breathing. Natalie blinked, surprised but not rattled. "Is there a problem?" she asked quietly. Richard folded his arms, making no effort to lower his voice. "People don't come in here asking for millions without a background. Security cameras are on, just so, I suggest you cooperate." His words weren't just for Natalie. They were for every customer, every staff member in earshot. Instantly, people pulled out phones. One young man in a blue jacket began quietly recording from the ATM line. Across the counter, a teller named Marisol Perez watched the scene with growing discomfort. She started at River Point only a year ago and had already seen enough to know this wasn't normal. Natalie's phone buzzed on the desk. The caller ID flashed quickly. U.S. Treasury Division Office. She declined the call, never looking away from Richard. "Sir, I'd appreciate if we could discuss this in private. I don't think these questions need an audience." But Richard's tone only got louder. "Transparency matters, Ms. Brooks. My job is to protect the bank and our customers from fraud. You wouldn't believe how many people try to scam us these days." The security guard inched closer, scanning Natalie's face for any sign of trouble, but all he found was patience. She sat quietly, hands folded on her lap. From behind the bulletproof glass, Marisol exchanged worried glances with another teller. "Is he really going to embarrass her in front of everyone?" she whispered. Richard leaned over the desk, voice dropping to a sneer. "Let's be honest. This is a waste of my time and yours. People like you need to understand how banks work." The comment stung, echoing off marble floors and high ceilings. Natalie said nothing, but her eyes hardened. A woman sitting near the entrance, an older customer named Mrs. Grayson, who'd banked at River Point for decades, put her knitting aside and frowned. "Is all this really necessary?" she asked quietly, but Richard ignored her. The crowd in the lobby grew restless. Whispers traveled from one corner to another. Natalie's phone buzzed again. This time, the caller ID read FBI, Agent Connor. She declined once more, never breaking eye contact with Richard. The man behind her in line whispered, "Is this really happening?" His words would soon echo across social media as other phones quietly recorded. Richard opened Natalie's folder at last, flipping through pages with visible skepticism. "You want to open a community outreach center, but where's your real backing? Who are your partners? Where's your collateral?" His voice was icy, practiced in the art of rejection. Natalie answered every question calmly. Her responses measured, clear, and professional. "My financial partners are listed on page 3. I have documented assets, matching funds, and community support. My credit reports and business licenses are also included." But Richard barely glanced at the documents. He seemed determined to find a reason to deny her, his prejudice growing more obvious with every minute. He leaned back and announced loudly, "Ma'am, I think it's time you leave before this becomes a legal matter. Security, please assist." Paul, the security guard, hesitated. Something about Natalie's composure made him pause. This wasn't the first time he'd seen unfairness at the bank, but it was the first time it felt so public, so final. "Sir, maybe we could," he started, but Richard cut him off. "I said escort her out. Now." Natalie stood slowly, collecting her folder. She looked around to silent faces in the lobby, at the phones recording, at Mrs. Grayson's worried eyes, at Marisol's pale expression. Then she met Richard's gaze and spoke in a voice clear enough for everyone to hear. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Hale. I'll be filing a formal complaint about this interaction." She turned and walked out, head held high, but what none of them knew, what even Natalie couldn't predict, was that this was just a beginning. The bank security footage, the phone recordings, and the quiet murmurs in the lobby were about to spark something much bigger than a denied loan. The heavy glass doors of River Point National swung shut behind Natalie Brooks, but inside, the storm she left behind was just beginning. For a moment, the lobby was silent, uncomfortable, charged. A dozen phone screens glowed quietly as customers lowered their arms, unsure they'd just witnessed a misunderstanding or something much darker. Mrs. Grayson pressed her lips together and reached for her knitting again, but her hands trembled slightly. At the counter, Marisol Perez kept her eyes down, trying to steady her breath. She wasn't sure whether she felt more anger or fear. The security guard, Paul, stood by the entrance, conflicted. The rules said follow the manager's orders, but nothing about today felt right. He looked at Richard Hale, who was already muttering into his office phone, voice clipped, eyes darting back and forth. "Yes, I had to remove a disruptive customer." "No, nothing major. Just being cautious," Richard whispered, as if wanting the world to shrink and the lobby to forget. But the world, as it turned out, was already watching. Out on the sidewalk, Natalie paused for a moment, phone still buzzing in her hand. The sky was blue, with sunlight pouring down, but her mind raced. What had happened in those 10 minutes? Why did a simple business meeting have to turn into a public spectacle? She checked her notifications. Already 3 texts from friends and a missed call from her mentor Dr. Ellis popped up. A fourth message came in from someone she barely knew. Asterisk. I think you were just in that bank. I saw you on someone's live stream. Asterisk. Natalie's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't noticed the people filming, but of course they had. In this world, stories travel fast, especially stories that don't sit right. Back inside the bank, tension still filled the air. Richard was determined to keep control. Paul, make sure she doesn't come back in, he snapped, voice low but urgent. Paul simply nodded, but inside, he wondered what he would do if she did return. Would he just follow orders or do the right thing? Near the ATM, a teenager named Tyler Chong checked his phone. He'd recorded most of the scene and sent it to his older sister, Tasha, who immediately posted it to her group chat with the caption, Asterisk, this is messed up. Share. Asterisk within minutes. The clip found its way onto social media. At first, just a handful of shares. Then dozens. Then hundreds. Faces, names, and reputations can change in the blink of an eye when the world is watching. Marisol watched Richard out of the corner of her eye. She knew he'd been strict before, but she'd never seen him go this far. She wanted to say something, but what could she do? Jobs were hard to come by, and bills never stopped coming. Still, her conscience prickled. She typed a quick message to her friend in another branch. Asterisk, hey, something bad happened. Our manager just kicked out a woman for asking about a loan. Customers are upset, not sure what to do. Asterisk. Meanwhile, Natalie stood outside, thinking she could just go home, pretend this didn't matter. But something in her gut told her this was bigger than just her. She remembered her grandmother's words. Asterisk, sometimes you got to be the one who stands up first, so others know it's okay to stand up, too. Asterisk, she took a deep breath, then dialed the number of the local news station. When the receptionist answered, Natalie kept her voice steady. I'd like to report a public incident at Riverpoint National Bank. I have documentation. Yes, I can come in. Back at the bank, Mrs. Grayson decided she'd had enough of feeling powerless. She got up, purse slung over her arm, and made her way to the front counter. Young lady, she said quietly to Marisol, I'm not sure what the rules are, but I want it noted that I did not approve of what just happened. That was no way to treat a customer. Marisol looked up, surprised and grateful. She nodded. Thank you, ma'am. I'll make a note. Maybe, she thought, more people would start speaking up now. On his way out, Tyler overheard two other customers whispering about the incident. Wasn't right. One muttered. No, it wasn't. The other agreed. But you know how it goes. But this time, it wasn't just going to go away. Richard Hale's phone buzzed with new notification. He glanced at the screen. His wife had texted, Asterisk, are you okay? There's something about your bank trending online. Asterisk, his stomach dropped. Social media? Trending? He hurriedly typed her back. All fine, just a misunderstanding. But doubt gnawed at him. On the city bus. 2 stops away, Tasha Chong stared at her phone in disbelief. The video her brother had sent her now had over 1,000 views and growing. Comments poured in. Asterisk, why'd they treat her like that? Asterisk, not surprised, honestly. Asterisk, hope she fights back. Asterisk, Natalie finally arrived at the news station. The front desk staff recognized her from a now viral clip. Are you? The receptionist started. Natalie nodded. Yes, I'm Natalie Brooks. I'd like to tell my side before the story gets twisted. The receptionist smiled. We've been expecting you. As Natalie sat down with a reporter, she laid out everything. Her business plan, her credentials, her experience, and the way she'd been dismissed and humiliated for simply requesting a loan. The reporter listened carefully, then asked, How do you feel about how things happened today? Natalie paused and said, I feel like this happens to a lot of people who never get their voices heard. Maybe today mine will. While the interview took place, the video kept spreading. Local radio picked it up. Then the city's biggest news website shared the story. Viral video shows black woman ejected from bank while applying for loan. Community reacts. Dozens of comments appear within minutes. Some outraged, some skeptical, all hungry for details. By dinner time, the number of shares had doubled again. Back at River Point National, Richard tried to return to business as usual, but nothing felt the same. Customers eyed him with suspicion. Paul, the security guard, watched the door, wondering if this was a day that would finally change how things worked in places like this. Marisol glanced at the clock, counting the minutes until she could go home. She wondered if she'd have the courage to do the right thing next time. Out on the street, Natalie sat quietly on a bench outside the news building. She was tired, but her resolve grew stronger with every new notification, every supportive message, every share. She knew a storm was coming, and for the first time, she was ready to face it. Because sometimes, it only takes one person's story to make the silence break. The sun had started to slip behind downtown buildings, painting the city in long golden streaks. But the story of what happened inside River Point National Bank was just getting started. By early evening, the video of Natalie Brooks' public humiliation had reached every corner of the city's social feeds. People who'd never set foot in the bank were now invested, sharing, commenting, and arguing in threads that seemed to multiply by the minute. Natalie watched it all unfold from her apartment, phone buzzing nonstop. There were messages from friends, strangers, even old classmates who hadn't spoken to her in years. Some wrote to say they were sorry. Others offered encouragement or shared their own experiences with discrimination. A few questioned her side of the story, but for every doubter, there were dozens more rooting for her. Sitting at her kitchen table, Natalie tried to process it all, the weight of so many eyes suddenly on her. She remembered feeling so small and invisible at the bank, but now her story was impossible to ignore. At the bank, things weren't quieting down. Richard Hale, the manager, sat in his office pretending to work, but constantly checking his phone. Every few minutes brought a new email from his bosses at regional headquarters. Subject lines like urgent, social media incident, and PR team requesting statement made his hands sweat. He tried to write a report explaining his side of things, how he'd only followed procedure, how it was a misunderstanding, how he didn't mean for it to escalate. But the words wouldn't come out right. Deep down, he knew what people had seen: a woman denied her dignity and a manager who didn't even give her a fair chance. Paul, the security guard, paced near the entrance. All shift he'd watch people come and go, some peering in the windows, others walking by with phones in their hands, as if expecting something else to happen. He felt nervous, but also hopeful in a way he couldn't explain. Maybe, he thought, it was time for the bank to change, not just the rules, but the way it treated people. At closing time, he told Marisol Perez, "You did good today," standing up for her. Marisol shook her head. "I didn't do enough. Next time, I won't be so quiet." Meanwhile, Mrs. Grayson called her daughter after leaving the bank. "It was the most uncomfortable thing I've ever seen," she said, voice trembling. "If that's how they treat people, maybe it's time we look for another bank." Her daughter listened carefully, then promised to write a letter to the bank's head office, describing what she'd witnessed. Across town at the local TV station, Natalie's interview aired on the evening news. The anchor summarized what happened, replayed parts of the now viral video, and cut to Natalie's calm, clear explanation. "I didn't come looking for trouble. I just wanted to invest in my own community. All I wanted was a chance." The news story ended with a call for viewers to share their own stories. Within minutes, the station's website crashed from all the traffic. By midnight, Natalie's phone had hundreds of notifications. Messages from advocacy groups poured in. Some offered legal help. Others wanted her to speak at upcoming events. One message caught her eye. It was from a woman named Angela Walker, a well-known civil rights attorney. "I saw your story." It read, "If you like to talk about your rights, I'm here. No pressure. Just know you're not alone." Natalie read it twice, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and fear. She wondered what might come next. Back at River Point National, the staff gathered for an emergency meeting the next morning. The district manager, Jonathan Parks, arrived early. He was a sharp dresser, younger than Richard, with a reputation for handling crises. He wasted no time. "We need to address what happened here yesterday. The video has over 1 million views. Corporate is demanding answers." Every staff member will be interviewed about their role. We have to show the public we're taking this seriously. Richard Hale's face turned pale. I was only doing my job, he said quietly, but nobody looked convinced, not even him. Jonathan laid out a plan. The bank would issue a public apology, invite Natalie to meet with senior leadership, and review its loan policies. He reminded everyone, we're a community bank. That means we serve everyone. Marisol looked down, remembering Mrs. Grayson's words. Paul nodded slowly, glad someone was finally taking charge. Natalie, for her part, spent the day answering phone calls. Reporters wanted interviews, organizations wanted statements, and friends wanted to know how she was holding up. By evening, she finally called Angela Walker, the attorney who'd reached out. Their conversation was warm and supportive. Angela listened without interruption, then explained, You have options, Natalie. What happened to you isn't just wrong. It may be illegal. If you want to pursue this, you'll have my full support. But the choice is yours. Natalie hesitated. She didn't want to fight, didn't want to become a symbol, but she also knew she couldn't walk away from what had happened. Let me think about it, she said. Angela replied, Take your time, but whatever you decide, I'll be here. As the days passed, the story refused to fade. Social media threads exploded with stories from people who felt invisible at banks, hospitals, schools, and offices. Natalie's experience became a rallying point, proof that small moments could expose bigger truths. At River Point National, changes started quietly. Customers came in and asked about what happened. Some closed their accounts. Others stayed but demanded better. Richard tried to keep a low profile, but rumors swirled about whether he'd keep his job. Staff whispered in break rooms, wondering if new policies were coming or if Natalie would return. Late at night, Natalie sat at her window, looking at the city lights. She still wasn't sure what would come next or if anything would really change. But one thing was clear. Her voice had broken the silence. People were paying attention. For the first time in a long while, Natalie felt a small hope stirring inside her. Sometimes when stories spread, the world shifts. And Natalie Brooks was beginning to realize her story was no longer just her own. The air was thick with anticipation as the days after the incident at River Point National Bank dragged on. Natalie's phone never stopped buzzing, and the inbox in her emails seemed to fill faster than she could read. As news outlets continued to pick up the story, the situation escalated. What had started as a viral video had morphed into a full-blown national conversation about racial discrimination, power, and accountability in banking. For Natalie, the weight of the situation began to feel like a quiet storm brewing inside her. She wasn't just fighting for her own dignity anymore. She was fighting for something bigger, something that had been ignored for too long. In the evenings, she found herself glued to the news, reading every update, every comment. Her heart ached every time she saw a new tweet or post about the event. But there was also a spark of pride. She had never imagined that something as simple as walking into a bank could set off a chain of events that might change everything. Meanwhile, inside River Point National, Richard Hale's world was crumbling. The pressure from corporate headquarters was mounting. Jonathan Parks, the district manager, had pushed for a public apology and meeting with Natalie. But even that wasn't enough to quiet the storm. We need something more, Jonathan said to Richard one afternoon, pacing in his office. A statement, an internal investigation, maybe a restructuring of some policies. The media is having a field day. Richard clenched his fists, eyes scanning the room. I'm doing everything I can, he muttered. But deep down, he knew it wasn't enough. The old tricks, the old ways of doing things, weren't working anymore. Across town, the ripple effects of the incident were being felt everywhere. Local activists rallied, calling for greater transparency in banking institutions. Politicians weighed in, using Natalie's story to push for legislation that would make it harder for banks to discriminate based on race or socioeconomic status. Congressional hearings were being scheduled, and reporters from all over the country were now knocking on Natalie's door. She couldn't walk down the street without seeing her face on a newsstand or hearing her name in conversation. In one particularly moving interview with a national network, Natalie spoke about her experience with calm strength. This isn't just my fight. This is about everyone who's been treated like this, who's been denied opportunities simply because of how they look or where they come from. It's time for change. The interview reached millions of viewers and sparked even more conversations online. People of all races, ages, and backgrounds were now calling for accountability, sharing their own stories, and asking questions about how such discrimination could still exist in modern society. Back at River Point National, things were starting to change, but not in the way Richard had hoped. The complaints about him piled up, and a growing number of customers began to speak out. One by one, they stepped forward, people who had witnessed the incident or who had experienced similar treatment themselves. A petition began circulating online, calling for Richard's removal from the bank. It gathered thousands of signatures in just a few days. Mrs. Grayson, the elderly woman who had spoken up in the bank that day, became a voice for those who had felt powerless. She had spent decades banking at River Point, and she wasn't about to let this injustice slide by unnoticed. She gave interviews to local news outlets, describing the incident in vivid detail. That young woman did nothing wrong, she said in one interview, but she was treated like a criminal. And I'll tell you what, it wasn't right. It wasn't right at all. As more stories came to light, Richard's credibility began to unravel. At a meeting with upper management, Jonathan Parks said, "We need to acknowledge the problem head on. If we don't, the media is going to continue to define this, and it's not going to go away. We have to act." Richard's response was barely audible. "I didn't mean for it to get like this. I just thought I was doing the right thing." Jonathan stared at him for a moment before responding sharply. "You didn't do the right thing, Richard, and now we have to make things right." Back in the heart of the city, Natalie's life was changing in ways she hadn't expected. As much as the attention felt overwhelming, she could see the hope it brought to others. People who had once felt like their voices didn't matter were now finding power in their stories. Social media posts, community meetings, and even public protests were springing up around the idea that people in power had to be held accountable for their actions. What started with one woman standing up in a bank had grown into a movement, one that would demand justice not just for Natalie, but for everyone who had been silenced. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Angela Walker, the civil rights attorney who had reached out to her earlier. "Natalie," Angela said, her voice calm and professional, "I think it's time we consider what comes next. The bank is under pressure, but we have an opportunity here. We need to act." Natalie nodded, feeling a sense of resolve flood through her. "What do we do now?" "We make sure they know the price of their actions," Angela said. "But we also make sure people understand that real change is about more than just one person. It's about the system, and the system needs to change." The following week, River Point National Bank issued a public apology. The statement was an attempt to shift the narrative, to show that they were taking steps to address the incident. But by now, it was clear to everyone that the apology wasn't enough. People were waiting for real action, for concrete steps to prove that the bank was ready to change. Richard was quietly called into a meeting with the regional director. His hands were cold, and he felt the weight of the room pressing down on him. When the door closed behind him, the director's voice was firm. "Richard, we've received numerous complaints. You're suspended until further notice. We'll be conducting an internal investigation. You'll be contacted with further instructions." The words hit Richard like a blow. He knew this was only the beginning of his downfall, and he had no idea how he would explain himself. The apology he had written couldn't undo the damage, and now it seemed like his career at River Point was over. Outside the walls of the bank, the fight continued to gain momentum. The public had spoken, and their voices were impossible to ignore. What had started with one woman's story had transformed into a wave of accountability that rippled through institutions far beyond River Point National Bank. Natalie sat at her table, watching the news again, when her phone rang. It was Angela. "It's time, Natalie. The ball's in your court. What do you want to do?" Natalie paused, knowing that the future of this movement, and her role in it, was about to unfold. For the first time, she felt ready. Ready to stand firm. Ready to keep fighting. Ready to take back what was hers. Natalie barely slept that night. She lay awake, phone screen glowing in the dark, scrolling through message after message. Each one seemed to say the same thing in 100 different ways. We believe you. Thank you for standing up. Your story gave me courage. I've been there too. Some messages made her cry quietly. Others made her feel strangely strong, as if the voices of so many strangers had built a wall behind her back. She had never felt more exposed, but she had also never felt so supported. The next morning, the city felt different. It was as if the whole community was holding its breath, waiting for what might happen next. At Riverpoint National Bank, staff gathered early for a meeting called by District Manager Jonathan Parks. Things are moving fast, he began, standing at the front of the room, eyes serious. We are under review by the Federal Compliance Office. There will be investigators on site today. I expect every one of you to cooperate fully. His gaze lingered a moment on Richard Hale, who sat at the end of the table, silent and pale. This is not a suggestion, Jonathan finished. It's a requirement. Rumors flew through the building. Some whispered that Natalie had government connections, that the investigation was bigger than anyone had guessed. Others just wanted things to go back to normal, but everyone sensed that the old normal was gone for good. As the sun rose higher, 2 black SUVs pulled up outside the bank. For people in crisp suits and government badges stepped out and entered the building, led by a tall black woman with sharp, intelligent eyes. She introduced herself as Ms. Lillian Carter, Senior Federal Compliance Officer. Her team moved with a calm authority that was impossible to ignore. We're here to review all recent loan denials and interview the staff, Ms. Carter said. Please make the records available and clear your schedules. Richard's hands shook as he gathered files, his mind racing. This wasn't just a local investigation. This was a federal government, and that meant consequences he couldn't talk his way out of. Word of the federal team's arrival spread quickly on social media. Customers began to gather outside, some holding signs, others just watching, waiting to see what would happen. Local news trucks arrived, antennas raised, reporters calling out for comments. Inside, tension built. Marisol Perez, who'd quietly documented everything she'd seen, found herself sitting across from Ms. Carter. Can you tell me what you witnessed last week? Ms. Carter asked. Marisol nodded, voice steady. Yes, ma'am. I saw Mr. Hale dismiss Ms. Brooks without properly reviewing her application. He embarrassed her in front of everyone. He didn't even look at her documents. Ms. Carter made notes. Thank you. Your honesty is appreciated. It helps us understand what's been happening here. Richard's interview was longer. Ms. Carter asked detailed questions about his training, his decisions, his process for reviewing loan applications. Richard tried to defend himself, saying he was only following protocol, but Ms. Carter's expression never changed. Protocols are important, she said, but fairness and equal treatment are required by law. If you cannot guarantee that, you cannot work in this industry. By midday, Natalie received a call from Ms. Carter herself. Ms. Brooks, I'd like to meet with you, she said. Would you be willing to come in and discuss your experience with us directly? Natalie took a deep breath. Yes, I'll be there. Arriving at the bank felt surreal. The same glass doors, the same marble floors, but the atmosphere was different. Employees stood aside as she entered, heads lowered in quiet respect, or perhaps guilt. Ms. Carter greeted her with a firm handshake. Thank you for coming, Ms. Brooks. We appreciate your courage. Natalie sat down across from her, hands folded tight. I didn't want any of this, she said quietly. I just wanted to help my community. Ms. Carter listened closely, never interrupting as Natalie explained what happened from her own perspective. The words, the humiliation, the feeling of being invisible. You did the right thing by speaking up, Ms. Carter said when she finished. What happened to you was wrong, and it's not just about you. We're finding a pattern of similar complaints at this branch, and at others. Your case may change more than just this one bank. Across the city, people watched updates in real time. News channels ran live feeds of the bank. Experts debated on talk shows, and hashtags trended online. Hashtag Justice for Natalie and hashtag Banking Equality topped local social media lists. Some people told their own stories, while others demanded resignations and accountability. Back inside the bank, Ms. Carter's team completed their review. The numbers were shocking. In the past year, River Point National had denied loans to black and minority applicants at a rate 3 times higher than the white applicants, even when their qualifications were nearly identical. Ms. Carter presented her findings to Jonathan Parks and the board. This isn't just about one manager or one decision. This is a systemic issue, and it will require real change. Jonathan nodded, looking exhausted. What do we need to do? Ms. Carter outlined federal requirements. Immediate training for all staff, the creation of a community oversight board, mandatory reporting on all future loan decisions, and suspension of Richard Hale pending further investigation. If these conditions are not met, the bank will face severe penalties, including possible closure. As the news broke, Richard's world collapsed. He was escorted from the building, not as a respected manager, but as a warning to others. For Natalie, it felt bittersweet. She hadn't wanted anyone to lose their job, but she knew real change never came without consequences. The day ended with Natalie and Ms. Carter standing together outside the bank. Cameras flashed. Reporters called out questions, but Ms. Carter spoke firmly. Today, the system listened to someone it tried to silence. We're here to ensure this never happens again, not just for Ms. Brooks, but for everyone who walks through these doors. Natalie looked around at the faces watching her. For the first time since that awful day, she allowed herself to believe things could really change. The real power, she realized, was never about money or status. It was about people standing together, telling the truth, and refusing to back down. By the following week, the city wasn't just watching. The whole country was paying attention. Natalie Brooks' name was now headline news. The story of the woman who walked into a bank seeking a chance for her community and walked out sparking a federal reckoning appeared on TV, radio, and every social platform. People in neighborhoods Natalie had never visited started holding their own meetings, discussing fairness in banking and sharing stories that echoed her own. But for Natalie, all the attention was both empowering and exhausting. She kept up with messages as best she could, but the calls never stopped. The interviews kept coming and the questions grew more intense. One morning, as she poured her coffee, she looked at her reflection in the kitchen window and hardly recognized herself. Not just because the world saw her differently, but because she discovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The real changes, though, were happening inside River Point National Bank. Jonathan Parks, the district manager, worked day and night, reviewing loan policies, meeting with Ms. Carter's federal team, and talking to employees about what real fairness should look like. The bank had never experienced a shakeup like this before. Every morning started with a new training about equal opportunity, about bias, about how to serve every customer with dignity. There were open forums where employees could speak honestly, some sharing things they'd held inside for years. Marisol Perez, once the quiet teller, was now one of the most vocal voices for reform. She spoke at meetings about what she had witnessed, about the fear she'd felt, and about her regret for not speaking up sooner. "I want to help fix this," she said, and for the first time, her words truly mattered. Other employees followed her lead, admitting mistakes, learning, and promising to do better. Customers, too, felt the difference. The bank set up a hotline for anyone to report concerns, and community members sat in on board meetings, holding leadership accountable in real time. The new policies were posted publicly. No more vague loan denials, no more unexplained rejections, no more secrecy. Every application would be reviewed with full transparency, and every denial would come with a written explanation and a chance for appeal. Word of these changes spread quickly. Other banks across the city, and even in neighboring states, started receiving calls and emails from people who demanded better treatment. Some institutions quietly updated their own policies, hoping to avoid a repeat of the River Point disaster. Others reached out to Natalie, asking her to speak or consult, hoping to understand what real fairness might look like. Natalie, though, remained focused on her original goal, opening the community outreach center that had sparked the whole ordeal. With Angela Walker's help, she filed the paperwork again, this time with support from city leaders, local business owners, and a growing list of allies. The bank, now eager to prove itself, not only approved her loan, but also offered to help fund the grand opening. The day the loan was finalized, Natalie visited the branch. It felt surreal to walk back through the doors that had once felt so hostile. Now, she was greeted by staff who looked her in the eye and offered genuine smiles. Even Jonathan Parks was there, ready with a handshake. "Congratulations, Ms. Brooks. I hope your center brings great things to our city," he said, and for once, she believed he meant it. Ms. Carter and her team completed their investigation, issuing a public report that detailed the problems and outlined the reforms now underway. "This is a model for what should happen everywhere," she said at the press conference. "We cannot change the past, but we can ensure that it doesn't repeat itself." Richard Hale's story ended far differently. The investigation revealed he had a pattern of bias, not just with Natalie, but with dozens of applicants over the years. He was formally dismissed, banned from holding a management position at any financial institution in the future. The news of his termination sent a clear message to other managers everywhere. Business as usual was no longer good enough. For Natalie, there was no sense of revenge in the outcome. She didn't celebrate Richard's downfall. Instead, she focused on what could be built from the ashes. "People ask if I'm angry," she told a journalist. "But really, I'm hopeful. I want others to see that standing up, even when you're scared, can make a difference." Across the city, the impact was real. Community groups reported an increase in approved loans for minority-owned businesses. New businesses began to open, cafes, bookshops, tech startups, all led by people who once thought the system was closed to them. Neighborhoods that had been ignored for years started to see investment and growth. Local leaders credited Natalie's story for making the impossible suddenly possible. At the Outreach Center, construction moved quickly. Volunteers poured in, some with building experience, some with nothing but willingness to help. Natalie was there every day, painting, sweeping, welcoming people with the same kindness she wanted from the bank that first day. The center's mission, printed in big, bold letters above the front door, read, "A place where every voice matters." Angela Walker, her attorney and now her friend, stopped by with coffee one afternoon. "You changed a lot more than just a policy, Natalie," she said. "You gave people hope." Natalie smiled, watching neighbors gather outside the center, kids laughing and playing, adults shaking hands. "I couldn't have done any of this alone," she replied. "It took a whole community willing to say, 'Enough is enough.'" As the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the city lights blinked on, Natalie took a moment to breathe. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, media interviews, the center's grand opening, maybe more criticism. But tonight, she let herself feel proud. Proud that her story, once silence in a bank lobby, was now the voice of change. The ripple effect had started with one woman, but it would continue through thousands. The grand opening of the Brooks Community Outreach Center was everything Natalie had hoped for and more. 100 people lined up outside, most of them strangers, some of them familiar faces from the neighborhood, all coming together to witness the culmination of everything that had started with one act of standing up. For Natalie, it was more than just cutting a ribbon. It was the moment when her story finally came full circle. The center was simple, but full of heart. There were classrooms for job training, rooms for local entrepreneurs to work, and a large meeting space for community discussions. Outside, a mural painted by local artists covered the wall of the building, a vibrant display of hope, strength, and unity. But perhaps the most significant part of the center was the bulletin board near the entrance. It was filled with pictures of people who had made a difference, the local business owners, activists, and parents who had rallied behind the cause. And there, in the center of it all, was a picture of Natalie Brooks standing in front of the bank, a quiet smile on her face, defying all the expectations that had once been placed on her. As she spoke to the crowd that day, her words were steady, but her heart raced with emotion. "This isn't just my victory," she began. "This is a victory for everyone who's been silenced, for every person who's walked into a bank, an office, a classroom, and been told they didn't belong. I'm just one example of what happens when you stand up and speak out, no matter how hard it is." The crowd erupted in applause. For a moment, it felt like everything she had worked for was paying off. But the truth was, it was just the beginning. Natalie knew that the work of the center would never be done. There would always be new challenges, new barriers to break down. But the energy in the room that day, the overwhelming support from her community, was a reminder that change was not just possible, it was happening. Meanwhile, the repercussions of her story rippled far beyond the city limits. River Point National Bank, still under investigation, had started to implement some of the changes suggested by Ms. Carter's federal team. They had introduced a new policy, one that required all loan denials to be documented in detail, with clear reasons for the decision. Employees were undergoing extensive diversity and sensitivity training, but the damage had already been done. River Point's reputation had been irrevocably damaged, and their actions were now under scrutiny of regulatory bodies nationwide. Richard Hale, the former manager who had sparked it all, had been blacklisted from working in banking. His career, once secure, had ended in disgrace. He now worked a desk job at a small insurance firm, far removed from the world of financial management. Every so often, he would check his phone to see the latest articles about the fallout from the incident. He could no longer avoid the reality of what had happened. What he had thought would be a minor incident had transformed into a national movement. As for Maria Gonzalez, the teller who had silently witnessed the entire ordeal, her life had changed in ways she hadn't expected. After her promotion to branch manager, Maria became a leader in the fight for better banking practices. She worked closely with community organizations to create partnerships that would help small businesses in underserved areas access financial support. People who had once been denied loans now found themselves with opportunities they had never thought possible. But perhaps the most surprising change came from the FBI, who, after months of investigation into banking discrimination, announced that they would be investigating all major financial institutions for potential civil rights violations. The federal investigation, which had started with one woman's complaint, was now a full-blown national effort, bringing a level of accountability to the banking sector that it had never seen before. News outlets continued to cover the story. Politicians spoke out about the need for stronger protections against discrimination. Banks began to quietly change their lending practices, fearing that they, too, might face the same kind of public scrutiny. It wasn't just a few isolated incidents anymore. It was a movement, a demand for change that couldn't be ignored. In the months that followed, Natalie Brooks became something of a symbol of courage, of perseverance, and the quiet power of everyday people to demand a better world. She continued to speak at events not just about banking discrimination, but about what real change looked like, about creating systems of accountability, about empowering communities, and about challenging the status quo when it was wrong. But even with all the accolades, the interviews, the public praise, Natalie never forgot what started it all. The simple act of asking for a loan, the way she was treated at River Point National Bank, and the personal cost of standing up. She kept a quiet humility about her, focused on the work that needed to be done rather than the attention she had received. In a heartfelt moment during an interview, a reporter asked, "If you could say one thing to Richard Hale, what would it be?" Natalie paused, considering the question carefully. "I'd tell him he made a mistake," she said. "But I'd also tell him that everyone has a chance to change. It's never too late to do the right thing. If he's learned anything from this, he should use it to make things better, not worse." And in a way, that became the heart of the movement Natalie had started. Change, real, lasting change. It wasn't about pointing fingers at people who had wronged her. It was about creating a system where wrongs could be righted, where people could grow, and where communities could rise together. As the weeks turned to months and the months to years, the Brooks Community Outreach Center became a beacon in the city. It wasn't just a place to get a loan or start a business. It was a symbol of what was possible when people came together to demand change. The center helped thousands of local entrepreneurs, provided mentorship, and created jobs in neighborhoods that had long been overlooked. And Natalie, with her steady resolve, continued to lead the charge. But it wasn't just her. The ripple effect of her courage had spread to countless others, each person in their own way deciding that enough was enough. Whether it was a single mother starting her own business or a young man learning how to build a resume, Natalie's legacy was one of empowerment, a legacy of showing people that the power to change the world was always within reach. By the time Natalie Brooks stood at the podium of a national conference on community development, The room was packed with people who had been touched by her story. As she spoke about the importance of financial quality and the need for continuous vigilance, she looked out at the crowd, knowing that this was just the beginning. Her work wasn't finished, but it would never be the same. She had lit a spark, and that spark was now a fire that would burn for generations to come, changing lives, changing policies, and creating a future where everyone had an equal chance to succeed.